A very warm welcome to you all to this evening's meeting of the White Allies Network, where we explore this question, reparations about time. Is it about time we address this issue in the 21st century? Or is it about time we thought it's a history best forgotten? We need to forgive and forget and move on. That's going to be the challenge of our panel this evening. And I'm just so delighted at the panel that we have. The giants of academia, of the media, of film and journalism, and that's just Robert Beckford, let alone everybody else. But no, I'll talk about, I'll introduce everybody in a bit more detail a bit later. But you are very welcome, whether or not you're like me, an aspiring white ally, or a person of colour who is happy to journey with us as we seek to become better allies against racism. You are very, very welcome. Let's introduce our panel now. Professor Robert Beckford, one of our leading UK Black academics. In fact, isn't it easier just to say he is the leading UK Black academic? Probably. It's probably accurate to say that. Now at Winchester University, the director of the Institute for Climate and Social Justice, having previously been at the Queen's Foundation, and is an activist scholar working interdisciplinarily to address, confront, and overturn injustice in African mainland and diaspora communities. But he's also a BAFTA award-winning documentary maker, whose credits include the hard-hitting 2005 Channel 4 documentary, The Empire Pays Back, which was one of the first, I think, attempts to really quantify compensation and what was owed, in a sense, to those that were enslaved and suffered at the hands of the transatlantic slave trade. If you go back and search online, you'll find a number of his documentaries still available. In fact, a few of them we have put links to in our resource network, and you can access them via that means. And just more recently, this was very brave, I must confess, Robert, hats off to you, but you managed to share, it was a long-running family argument in a BBC Radio 4 series dealing with the experiences of the Caribbean immigrants who came to the UK as part of the Windrush generation, and whether or not even their own children should return to the Caribbean. So hats off to you for that very brave Radio 4 series. And secondly, we have Alex Renton, who is an award-winning investigative journalist, has written articles for all the big dailies, I would suggest. But 2021, wasn't it? He wrote Blood Legacy, which was reckoning on his own family's story of slavery, which was longlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize. I've just finished reading that myself, and I really do recommend it to you as a real insight from a variety of perspectives into what it was like to both run a plantation in the Caribbean, but also what kind of suffering was produced as a result of that. So I do recommend Alex's book to you. And then we also have John Dower, an award-winning filmmaker, and so many of the household names he has been involved in directing at some stage, of EastEnders, Casualty, Silent Witness, just being some examples of those. But also some of our most popular computer games, he's been involved in directing some of the cinematic sequences for those. He also took a lead when he discovered his own family's history from the slave trade of leading the Trevelyan family's apology to Grenada. Just earlier this year, he led his family's apology there. Both of them, Alex and John, are founder members of the Heirs of Slavery, and we are very pleased that you could join us this evening. Finally, although Suzanne is not on the panel, I just wanted to show her face because she will be taking those questions from you as we go through. So do put those questions in the chat as soon as anything appears to you. All right, I'm going to stop rambling now on that. And James, if we could just highlight our panel, that would be fantastic. And start to work through the questions. So my first question to you, gentlemen, is this. First of all, what do we mean by reparations? I don't know whether one of you could just give us a definition in a couple of sentences on what we mean by reparations. Anyone want to offer?
I think it should be Robert. You've billed us as an thank you, Adrian, as an expert panel, but I'm no expert on net reparations. I hope I'm good at listening to what people descended from the enslaved,
Sure.
would like to happen by way of repair.
Sure.
Robert's
Sure. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Let me first correct by saying I'm not the leading Black British academic. If I was, we'd be in serious trouble. There are people who are working at more prestigious institutions than mine and who have done more scholarly work than me. My genius, if at all, has just been getting to some of these issues first, then bringing them to public attention. So I shouldn't take credit for the work of other people who are doing more dynamic things than me. But to get to the point, reparations, look, it is a complex and diverse and contradictory concept. But there are three things that help us think through it. The first is the notion of repair. It has its roots, its etymology in the notion of repair. So reparations is about repairing damage that has been done. Now, there's a legal definition. The legal definition emerges after World War II, and that deals with transitional justice. The idea that when great wrongs have been done, Holocaust, mass murder, a genocide, then normal legal practices are insufficient. So you need legal practices that deal with these large-scale atrocities and offer some kind of recompense. And that's the legal way of seeing this. And the recompense can be symbolic, it can be material, it can be financial, but it has to deal with the psychological, physical, emotional, political, cultural harm that has been done. And that's the definition that most people work with, and that has certain levers that you pull in order for reparations to take place. And we'll probably get into this later on, but if you watch the 2005 film, which you mentioned, Empire Pays Back, or more recently, the Brattle Report, we work through 5 levers that you have to use as measures for the kind of reparation that needs to take place, financial reparation specifically. But there's another definition that I work into reparations because of the African Caribbean background, and that's a spiritual definition. And why a spiritual definition? Well, for 2 reasons. First of all, because the idea of restitution, doing repair when damage has been done, is a very biblical idea. It has its roots in the Hebrew Bible. We see numerous stories and accounts of people doing wrong and then being asked to engage in recompense, acts of recompense. You've done wrong to somebody, you have to give them 2 chickens if you stole 1 chicken. The idea is that you give back more than what you have taken away. There's even reparation in the Hebrew Bible for historical structural injustice. It's a fantastic story in the book of Ezra. Sorry, I'm getting a little Bible study here. A fantastic story in the book of Ezra where King Darius recognizes that even it's 90 years since the Hebrews were taken into captivity, into bondage in Babylon. He decides to have a tax to pay back what they have lost and to help them rebuild Jerusalem. So notion that even if you haven't necessarily been involved yourself, because you may have benefited from that wrong, you should do something about it. That's the first reason it's in the Bible. The second reason is because it is the Rastafarian movement who for the last 80 years, so 1920s, have carried the reparations movement, and they viewed it as spiritual practice, as a return to Africa initially as part of their religious understanding of the centrality of Africa, and then also, or more recently, in 2020, understanding that there needed to be some kind of financial recompense as a consequence of that. So that's a useful way of seeing it in terms of its etymology. At its roots is this notion of repair, the legal category, that it requires some kind of restitution for large-scale damage, and that there are legal levers and measures that you use to measure the amount of compensation or reparation. And then thirdly, this is about reconciliation, about bringing people back together, uniting people and bringing about a sense of peace. And that peace isn't just the absence of war, but it's also the absence of any kind of oppressive system or process. And that's the spiritual dimension. So I tend to conflate those 3 definitions to broaden out what is understood by reparations.
Fantastic. Thanks, Robert. And I'll come back to you in just a moment, because I'd like to hear from each of you, all 3 of you, how you started to actually be become aware of this issue and this potential need for reparations? Maybe because Robert's been speaking, I'll go to the other two first. So, Alex, can I come to you? When did it start to become an issue that you started to feel passionate about? What were some of the triggers for you that you needed to address something here?
I mean, to my shame, I really very recently. And literally when I was digging around in, as I tell in my book, in the boxes of old family papers that my grandfather catalogued in a house in Scotland, and kept seeing the words Jamaica and Tobago coming up, and which has complete novelty to, a surprise to me. I mean, none of my generation had any notion that our family, who we'd been brought up to respect and kind of worship, really, as sort of great soldiers of empire and judges and politicians and so on, had been involved in the enslavement business. And of course, being a 62-year-old Briton, I was taught very little about the enslavement industry and Britain's involvement. Everyone here knows about that problem. But I think the key moment was, about 2 years after I started first reading those papers and transcribing them, it was finding myself in Tobago on the site of a plantation that one of my great grandfathers had owned, and asking people there what they thought I should do with this knowledge, and what the enslavement period, how it affected their lives today. And I think, in those fascinating conversations, I had the same in Jamaica a bit later as well. I was very lucky and privileged to, and people were very welcoming and really pleased to have the chance to talk about these things. Though there was a lot of anger and pain that needed expressing too. But what I was hearing was a desire for healing, for an ongoing trauma that was by no means over, and specifics were mentioned. I won't go into them there, but things that really made sense in terms of what the racist way in which my ancestors, who were Christians, or they called themselves such, had been able to enslave African people, Black people, and how that repeats today. And I think, I think that was the point when hearing from people, and almost everyone I spoke to in both countries said, acknowledgement, apology. That's your first job, and that's the beginning of curing, of addressing the history, stopping the pain which you white people's denial of it brings about, and the social consequences of that same denialism. And all those conversations started with talk about, as Robert says, about a healing process that started with acknowledgement and apology, and that was a absolutely blinding moment of revelation to me, but also a deeply shameful moment to think I'd got to 56 years old or whatever without realizing, despite living as a liberal journalist in modern Britain with a really wide friendship group, realizing what my brothers of color and sisters of color were going through.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. John, how about yourself? What kind of sparked your own awareness of the issues and passion for doing something about it?
I've got quite a similar story to Alex in a way. So what I'll do is I'll tell a story slightly differently from my perspective, and I'll give you 5 bullet points. First was 2016. I read an article by David Olusoga in The Guardian, which said any middle class or landed gentry or upper class person white person should go to the UCL Legacies of database now and find out whether their family were involved. And I thought, right, okay, I'll do that. And I went and I discovered, when I entered the word Trevelyan, which is my father's family, that we had owned, our ancestors had owned plantations on Grenada and been involved in enslaving people there. And I was completely dumbfounded, and my life changed at that moment, literally at that moment. And I rang my dad and said, we have to apologize for this. So he didn't know anything about it either. And I was very upset and angry and felt very let down and very shamed, and felt very ashamed of my ancestors not being, having swept all of this under the carpet. That's the first moment. The second moment, I think, because it took 7 years, this process, I do think that George Floyd's death has to be mentioned, because I think that was a seismic moment. Because I think what that did is it made a lot of people sit up and go, oh my God, this is a real I mean, I'm talking about people, white people, particularly people in my family. We were all sitting around in pandemic, I think, probably doing a bit of navel gazing, having a bit of time to think. And I think at that moment, I think people were very, very thought provoked. So I think that was an incredibly important moment in the galvanization of our family's apology. The third moment was the Colston statue going down, because as soon as that went down, I think people went, "Oh my God, this is happening here, and it's big, and it's, oh my God, what do we think about this?" Because all the people in my family who'd kind of gone, "Yeah, but is this really an important? Is this something we can do something about now?" I think they really began to see the bells ringing in the present day that had kind of ceased tolling for so many centuries. The fourth moment was when our family was addressed to Hilary Beckles, who was the head of Reparations Commission for CARICOM, and also the vice chancellor of the University of West Indies. And he just said something really, really, really powerful to us, because at that moment we were really doubting whether apology was something we could do, because there was a lot of people in the family, quite rightly, saying, you can't actually technically apologize for something you didn't do, which is actually, philosophically, I think, correct. But he said very simply, look, no one has come to the people of Grenada and apologized for what your ancestors did. No one has done that. And so if you do that, it will be a massive thing to do. And it's not that massive a thing for you to do. And it will be such a powerful message to be giving. So that speech that Sir Hilary gave to us as a family, I think, was the key turning point in our family's kind of, many people were persuaded that this was something we should do. And then my last point was just the moment we stood in the hall in St. George's in Grenada, me and Laura Trevelyan, my cousin, and we read out our family apology. And suddenly at that moment, I realized I
think we might need to come back to John to hear his last point there. But can I turn to you, Rob? You've been writing and broadcasting about this issue for longer than most of us have been even aware of it. But when was the first point that you kind of started to think about reparations, the potential need for it? Can you just give us an indication of what sparked that for you and when?
Well, people of my vintage who are in their late 50s can go back to the 1970s, when the notion of the notion of reparations was integral to Rastafari discourse in reggae music. So if you listen to reggae music from 1970 to 1980s, Burning Spear, Steel Pulse in Britain, even Bob Marley, Black Uhuru, all of these bands talked about reparations in terms of return to Africa, even a little bit earlier in the late 1960s with the Abyssinians. So it was part of my consciousness growing up, hearing this discourse in reggae music. So that was the beginning of thinking about it. But a real turning point came for me going to Jamaica and talking to my relatives and recognizing that they were not interested. Now, reparations was not really a popular theme across the Caribbean in the 1990s, even in the noughties, because Caribbean people thought that you could never repay for the damage that was done. So they just completely dismissed it. So my second awakening was being given the opportunity when I was working more consistently with Channel 4 to make Empire Pays Back. And the plan there was primarily not only to calculate reparations using financial measures and legal measures, but more so challenge Caribbean people to think more critically about the stance that they'd taken. And that battle was won. We featured both Hilary Beckles in the film. We didn't manage to get out to Jamaica. The Channel 4 budget wasn't big enough to give us that kind of trip. But we managed to engage Caribbean people with the film afterwards. And Vereen Shepherd, who went on to become the head of the reparations research unit at the University of the West Indies, Mona in Jamaica, she tells the story that when the film traveled across Jamaica, we never got the royalties for it though, but that's a whole nother story. When it traveled across Jamaica, being screened in various institutions, that was a catalyst for what then became CARICOM reparations. So for me, I feel really, really chuffed about the fact that the film played that role in sparking that movement and conscientizing people like Vereen, Hilary Beckles and others, and getting them moving on this project. So that was the second awakening to a degree. There's a third point, and this is another project which is more recent. Post George Floyd, I raised the issue again, but looking at the church's entanglement with transatlantic chattel slavery, and two media projects. One that was a critique of the USPG, called The Church's Slave Plantation, which went on BBC World Service, a 2-part documentary series, and then the independent film After the Flood, Slavery, the Church and Reconciliation. That was a 2022 independent film made for the Move for Justice and Reconciliation. That was to really engage with what was happening with the Church of England and within religious groups who reached a tipping point regarding reparations. So those 3 areas really, being brought up with it, Empire Pays Back, pushing the Caribbean folk to do more, and more recently trying to conscientize Christian communities.
Right. Brilliant. Thank you, Robert.
Adrian, can you still hear me?
Yes, John, you're back with
Right.
us.
Okay, look, I realised that it sounded as though my Wi-Fi cut out at my climax, which is very frustrating.
No, we were dying to hear your last point. So you
Okay, so the last point was this. I stood in front of this audience in Grenada making this apology, and I suddenly realised very clearly, with clarity, that I was being looked at as literally as a personification or as a representative of what my ancestors did, and it was an incredibly powerful, uncomfortable, enlightening moment in which I think the pennies dropped from my eyes, and I suddenly realized this is actually the relationship that I need to work on. I need to atone for this. I mean, meeting people in the hotel who were serving us who could well have been the descendants of the enslaved that my ancestors were involved with is incredibly humbling. And you go. I mean, I left Grenada a different person, I think, than I went, and I think that was a really, for me, a massively important moment to have experienced.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. For we were waiting with bated breath that last.
Yes, I apologise for my Wi-Fi.
Actually, while you have the floor, while your Wi-Fi is working well, the question for you and for Alex. I would imagine that there'd probably be members of your families that would say, for goodness sake, this is so long ago, why can't we just forget it? Why bring it all up again? Why bring up all this pain from the past? Why don't everyone just forgive and forget and move on from this, rather than bringing up in this day and age? What would your response to that, John, be first of all, and Robert? Yes,
we had a few people who had that attitude in the family, and I think over time that has really shifted. And I'll give you an example. Laura's uncle, Tom, who is in his 80s and is a retired doctor and is a very sensible person, very sort of, I'd call him quite middle of the road, quite straightforward. He very much felt like, why is this something that we can do anything about? It really, it's something we need to just move on from. Let's let bygones be bygones. And I think it was all of those things I was describing, all of those moments during, the death of George Floyd, Colston statue, the Black Lives Matter marches, and then Laura created a fantastic documentary called Grenada Confronting the Past, which was commissioned by the BBC, where she went to Grenada and filmed on some of the plantations that the family had been involved with. And I think at that moment he's a good representative of what I would call a kind of middle England kind of attitude. I think he is completely changed. He came with us to Grenada. He says to me, John, I was wrong. I now understand that what you were talking about was something really significant. So I think that's for me, he's a really good barometer and a good, for me, a success story of where we might go with this. I mean, I hope that represents other people in Britain and that we can start to persuade them. But certainly it is a journey that we've got to go on with people.
Sure. Thanks, John. Alex, what about yourself? What would your counter argument be?
Yeah, there's a rift in our family, certainly. I mean, it's only a small, it's only, I think, probably 40 of the extended family are completely on side. They're not happy. I mean, but they can see why this is the right thing to do, and why we should feel shame at not having done it earlier. And 2 or 3 are very, very angry, and really for not good reasons at all, but they're interesting and useful because they kind of reflect something that's going on in British culture generally. Because we all know that there is, the old white right, as I like to call them simply, are in denial about this history, as they are any criticism of Britain's colonial history and history as an empire. And what I've come to realize, because people I love now have turned out to be on that, on that side is that it's an existential challenge to their self-belief, their understanding of themselves as white Britons, and that, you know, and the best people from the best empire there ever was, I say with a very wry smile, because that is what we were taught, and this is and it's behind an awful lot. That British exceptionalism is behind an awful lot of things that now go wrong, are wrong in this country. What's been really exciting, I think, for John and me and others, and is this experience of you know, doing our own apologies and saying we're listening, we're here, we'd like to ally and support with black activist movements for equality and for reparations. Is everyone who's done it so far, and we have a lot of conversations with people saying, I'm thinking of doing this, what are the risks, you know, will I get my windows smashed? I mean, I've literally had that question asked, is being able to tell what a positive thing it's been, how everybody from David Lascelles, who first did this back in 2007, has said it's expanded their world, it's made them feel, you know, more at peace with the family history that is not, they can't avoid having, and has brought friendship and kindness and different perspectives into their lives, and it's been entirely an enriching experience. We're very privileged, people like John and me, to be able to do this at all.
Right.
And to have the chance to go out and say, right, and talk to our neighbours of colour and start those conversations.
Thank you, Alex. I want to turn to Robert, but with a very specific question around this, because Robert, you talked about the kind of spiritual aspect of it. You're a Christian theologian. What about the doctrine of forgiveness? What about those that would say, hang on a minute, isn't it time to forgive and forget? If you're coming from a Christian perspective, forgive, forget, and move on, rather than dig up the pain and the stuff from the past. What would your response to that be, Robert?
Sure. Firstly, I'd correct the theology, because forgive and forget isn't necessarily part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. You know, it's a little bit more sophisticated and demands a bit more. A good story to work with, the story of Zacchaeus in the New Testament, where Jesus encounters a tax collector, a bad person who's done bad things to people financially. Jesus encounters him, and he gets converted on the spot, and decides that he's going to repay 4 times as much as what he's taken away from people. And that's a better example of how encountering injustice and transformation works. It isn't necessarily just about forgiving and forgetting, it's about making amends for the injustice. There's also an argument that you don't forget until if the injustice is continuing. You know, there's a theological tradition that works that way. But in terms of forgiveness, we have to see it as 2 parties coming together as a consequence of a process. And I think there's a very specific process at work here. I think that reparations begins with dealing with what Alex has spoken about, what the great dean of British sociology, Stuart Hall, used to describe as selective historical amnesia. We have a lacuna in our history when it comes to the slave and colonial world. So we have to begin with truth seeking. We have to really mine the historical archives and work out what actually took place. And there's been some great work on this. UCL database, the work they're doing out at Mona, other places now opening up their archives. Lloyd's, who back in 2005 shut their doors to us, is now opening up their doors. After that, there has to be truth telling, and that's where the heirs have to tell the truth, and that's what they've been doing. You know, with Trevelyan family, with Alex, with the other families. That's an important part of this is truth telling, saying this is what happened. You know, and then I think there's another stage which is then where you get to negotiating and thinking about the kind of repair and the multifaceted nature of repair that there is, and that process then takes you into reconciliation. And reconciliation does involve the gift of forgiveness, you know, because it's a gift, you know, in the Christian tradition, in the same way that being able to say that you're sorry is a gift, you know, in the Christian tradition as well. And then you kind of journey together. So it's much more than a one-off instant thing. It's a journey that people are on and that they have to work at for some time.
Could I say one other thing, which is a point I missed? I mean, the key argument I use, and it happens a lot talking to the media, talking to the right-wing press, and with my own family, is it is not ancient history. A history isn't over while its after effects are still active. And I say to people, you have black friends, go out and ask them in what way the story of enslavement, the enslavement period, affects Black lives in Britain today. And about time you ask that, because you will be told very frankly and very simply and statistically exactly how that happens, both in racism and health outcomes and judicial outcomes and educational outcomes and so on. It is a live history. We'd have no right to say it's over and ancient. And I think actually we as white allies can put that argument quite well.
Right. And you make some really good points around that in your book, Alex, don't you, in terms of the long-term impact in Jamaica, specifically. And that's something that we've been learning a lot about in the White Allies Network, about the long-term impact, the legacy of empire and colonialism, and the fact there's more money coming out of Africa in interest payments than there is going in as aid or any development help at all. You know, that was quite a revelation to us as a network. And the legacy in health and economics and education, just mental health, particularly in self-esteem, has just had such an enormous impact for generations, hasn't it? And we're certainly learning that afresh as a network here. I wonder whether we can turn to then, well, what still needs to be done? As a slavery, you've explained some of the things that you've been doing, but what needs to be done on I guess on three levels? You know, for the heirs of slavery, you've been tackling at the family level, haven't you? You've been looking at what the responsibility of your ancestors there, but open to whoever wants to answer this to start with. I'd like it to kind of someone to say, well, what should be happening at individual level, maybe family level, and at governmental level? What I don't know whether one of you wants to tackle each one of those, but what, and you might share something of what you know is already going on, but what still needs to happen? What are the key things, would you say? Open to all three of you. Would like to say that. Who'd like to tackle that first?
I mean, I might quickly say that, I mean, if anyone goes to the Heirs of Slavery website, I'll post it into the chat. I mean, we formed this group, which is a sort of loose advocacy group, really to support and ally ourselves with activist movements seeking reparative justice. And I think because while there are wealthy heirs of slavery and not so wealthy heirs of slavery, anything we do in terms of the lives our ancestors destroyed and the subsequent legacy crimes is token. What we need is governmental action at governmental level through CARICOM, separately perhaps for the diaspora, and heirs of slavery is there to bring what influence we have as privileged white people to support the activist movement seeking that stuff, because that's how real change comes about, along with what we said about acknowledgement and apology.
Sure. Great, thanks, Alex. John, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I'm sorry, my Wi-Fi is again troubling me. I don't know whether Alex mentioned the really important thing that Heirs of Slavery are doing is to try and make other descendants of enslavers less intimidated and feel as though it's a safe space for them to come on board and to engage. We're setting up meetings. We've certainly had lots and lots and lots of people approaching us via our website who want to get more information. And I think it's that thing that Alex said before about people being scared of their windows being broken. I think that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to create a sense that this is actually a growing set of people. It's a growing coalition. And we're certainly getting lots and lots of interest. And I think that's a really important part of our work, is to create a safe space for people to come on board and engage in the conversation and try and grow with us.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Robert, I mean, I remember in The Empire Pays Back, you know, what you calculated to need to be paid back actually would bankrupt the country, and you said, you know, that's not feasible in those terms. And I haven't read the Brattle report yet, although that is on our website, so you can access that the full report on our resource page. What needs to happen at a governmental level, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Look, I think on a personal level, it requires moral courage. And I think that's what both the Heirs of Slavery have been doing and what you've been doing in terms of white allies. It requires, you know, that desire to do the right thing and take the risks that come with moral courage. I think that's what we all have to do on a personal level. I think on a social level, it's about educating people. There still is a battle in terms of making people aware of the slave and colonial history, how it continues to impact life in the present. I remember going on Radio 5 Live 10 years ago, and Simon Mayo saying, you know, slavery bad, racism bad, but I can't see the connection between the two. You know, Simon Mayo. So we still have to do that work. And that education coupled with moral courage, I believe, leads to conscientizing people, changing people. And a good example of that is if you see my piece in The Guardian from last week on the Beckford statue in the Guildhall. After that, I got a call from the Beckford hospitality company. I didn't know there was one. I'm in the West Country with you know, has about 200 people working for it, and they simply appropriated the name from a local hero, William Beckford, the Gothic novel, the originator of the Gothic novel, you know, and further conspiracies, not conspiracies, controversies are related to his background, and therefore they're not necessarily an inheritor of wealth or power from the slave and colonial world directly. But they felt that they'd made a mistake, and they wanted to know how do we address this. So we're involved in a really creative dialogue at the moment to look at how we can work through this issue. It isn't necessarily about changing the name. It's really about opening up opportunity to do some really progressive anti-racism work in the hospitality industry and in other sectors that they're involved in as well. So the education, I think, is still really, really important. And look, you know, if the polls are anything to go by, there will be a change in government in the next a year or so. And if there is, then there are real opportunities for getting state-based support and renewed interest. We do have the cross-parliamentary group at work at the moment. We do have key people in the Labour Party who are really committed to some kind of exploration at least, and I think that's where the big change will take place, because with government policy you can then change what happens in education. You can start investing in having some of the major reports and research that needs to take place in order for large-scale change to take place. Now, just one more thing about the figures. My approach to it is very different from the lawyers. You know, when you work with the lawyers, and the American lawyers in particular, they think any amount of money is repayable. That isn't part of their consciousness at all, you know. But my approach to this is just twofold. I think we have to do the calculations in order to honor the memory of the enslaved. We have to say this is what they actually contributed, and this is how much, you know, wealth was gained. But remembering that's not just one part of the repair, and then placing that in dialogue with what is feasible today. How does repair look like today? Because often the two do not necessarily equate. The problem has been that that hasn't often taken place. So if you look at the USPG case, where you have an Anglican missionary organization from 1710 to 1838/1834 running a slave plantation in the Barbados, and tried to keep the stock up to 300 enslaved Africans a year. So we're talking at least 1,000 plus people. Now, nobody has done the calculating, the math in terms of how many enslaved Africans do you have to compensate, and what levers do you have to use in order to come to a reasonable sum. Instead, what's happened there is the USPG has negotiated what they feel would be a reasonable settlement with the Codrington estate, not using any facts and figures, not being very transparent about it, not using any legal measures, and as a consequence, it's been rejected by commentators in Barbados. It may still be accepted by the college, because the college is in dire straits, you see, and that raises the question about the power relations in some of these negotiations, and people being able to pick and choose what they feel is restorative. So that's why I asked for the calculation, so we can get a clear idea of the debt. But obviously, I don't think USPG has over £1 billion in their coffers. But if that is the amount that is due, we need to at least acknowledge that, and then move into a phase of saying, well, what does repair look like for Barbados, for the USPG, and how do we go on this journey together?
Right, brilliant. And is there an end? Could there ever be an end to reparations, Robert? Bearing in mind just the kind of the massive debt that is owed, and as you say, we can't repay it all. But is there an end point at all? Can you ever see that?
Well, I think it's a journey to rebuild the world in the way that people thought they could do after empire. Now, after empire, these great anti-colonial leaders across Africa, across Latin America, had these great meetings, Bandung and others, where they attempted to think about what kind of institutions, global institutions, were necessary to restore their countries, give them self-determination, give them access to finance and global financial markets, restore their cultural traditions in the post-colonial world. And that's what they wanted. They wanted to, and there's actually a version of reparations which is constructivist. It's about investing in the civic institutions and organizations to build a better anti-racist future. So in many respects, it's not so much about will it end, it's about we need to start doing the work that many of the post-colonial activists and nations wanted to do at that point, including, you know, addressing the legacy of racism, legacy of colonialism as well. So for me, it's more about looking back than necessarily looking forward. We're starting a process that you know, has its origins not only in the colonial world, but in terms of the repair in the post-colonial world.
Thank you, Robert. Anything anyone else, any other panel members want to add in terms of how do we as a network, we want to be able to be activists in this area and not just talking about it? I think you've already mentioned issues of educating ourselves and of aligning ourselves with activists, Black activists in this area, so that we hopefully will earn the right to be called true allies against racism. But is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of practically what members of this network can do? From anyone? Yeah, Alex.
I think, I mean, Robert mentioned it. I mean, remember that discussing or answering at least the CARICOM call for discussions with European nations on a reparative justice plan in 2014, that was acknowledged in the 2019 Labour manifesto. I mean, there is one line there. I mean, anyone here with with a Labour Party candidate and a line into them, we're all voters, should be saying we want to see that in Keir Starmer's manifesto for next year, or better. I mean, the Dutch government, the Danish government have already gone further in answering the to an extent in answering the CARICOM call, at least in acknowledgement and apology. There are political openings, and I think good activism, good allyship and campaigning is seeing winnable results and pushing forward. And the next government could take this on, it's and I think also to add to Robert, I think I'm really sort of shocked by how many people like me who are kind of on side on the reparations. You can see the validity of the claim, don't really understand what's been asked for at all, and think it is just trillions, because that's what the Daily Mail has told them. Now, Robert's absolutely right. You need to quantify what the money lost by the Africans and all their descendants who were kidnapped and murdered by us, what that comes to. But the CARICOM plan, and everyone should read it, includes lots of reconciliatory, useful ideas, ranging from technology transfer to better educational opportunities, and a great idea which worked for Gordon Brown and the G8, which is cancellation of debt. That it's not just about writing a big fat check.
Adrian, just to add to that, I think the reason why people think, and this is particularly coming from the right-wing press, that it's all about money, is because a huge vacuum has been formed by the fact that the government and the institutions and the king are all silent. So we have no leadership on this. We have no responsible power answering what CARICOM, for example, has been asking for. And into that void, all sorts of rumors, ideas, whatever, the Twitterati, all of that just goes crazy. And so the reason why it's become so kind of slanderous and so horrific in terms of the kind of rumors and the nonsense that's been spoken in many places is because of that void. And that void, we need to fill it. The government need to stand up. And one thing I would say is that Rishi Sunak, this is something that Charlie Gladstone said, and I think he encapsulates it really well. Rishi Sunak, in answer to Bell Riviera's question about whether the government was going to think about reparations, he said, we don't want to unpick the past. And what about present? The present is a place where we can see the terrible divisions. We can see the repercussions of the great wound that was created through transatlantic chattel slavery. And so that I think is a really important question.